All right, thank you all for getting back with us. Our next panel involves another component of the state's efforts with regard to policy and regulation, and that is the energy offices. We're really pleased to have with us former Governor of Colorado, Bill Ritter, to lead this discussion. And Governor, we'll turn it over to you. Let's see, there we go.
Thank you, Commissioner. It's great to be here. Great to be with all of you. As he said, I am a former governor of Colorado, but my role in the last several years has been to direct a center at Colorado State University called the Center for the New Energy Economy. And we had the specific idea coming into that of working with governors. And since then have kind of expanded that to include governors, legislators, commissioners. We've done a lot of convening of states, and a lot of that has to do with Western states. When the Clean Power Plan was in its draft form, we convened all of the Western states, including all the ones represented here today. But we convened the Pacific Northwest, California, the whole Intermountain West, and then North Dakota and South Dakota, because they felt more akin to the West than they felt to the Midwest. And so they were part of it too. So we have 13 states looking at compliance, if in fact the Clean Power Plan were to become law, how the rest might comply with it. And part of the thing we talked about was actually this issue, resource adequacy in the grid, where the Clean Power Plan was concerned. And then a few years ago, a group of us at the center undertook a task at there's a group called WEIL, the Western Electricity Industrial Leaders, and they had asked me a question: hey, how can a utility function in a place like the West where you have policymakers with such different ideas about how to go forward? And they were referring specifically to the 2019 session in the legislature, where states like my home state, Colorado, New Mexico, Nevada, had all passed climate legislation. And PacifiCorp was one of the CEO of PacifiCorp was in the room, and they serve, I think, 5 or 6 different states with very different policy interests in those different states. And they said, is there any way to get like the governors together and just have one policy? And I said, yeah, not on your life. It's not going to happen. But here's a thing we could do: is look at issues of resource adequacy, transmission planning, and what we call greenhouse gas accounting, because of the greenhouse goals that many of the states had in place. And so we undertook that and had an entire discussion about resource adequacy and representation from all of the states in the West, including Montana. And at the end of the day, I wrote a paper, and the paper really looked at, is there a reason to, instead of thinking only about a regional market, to take steps toward regionalization of planning, where it is not in a formal way, but at least there are these open discussions. And I think that's very much, in my mind, what Commissioner Johnson has in mind here, is to at least take a strong look at that. And he calls it sub-regional because it's the 4 states. But I also, this morning, if you heard Commissioner Petrie from Wyoming, he said, we have to pay attention to what every state around us is doing. We can't pay attention to just Wyoming. And I think that's probably fair of all of the states, that you could even take a sub-region and say, well, it's just these 4 states that are going to concern us here. And yet each of those 4 states that are part of the sub-region are going to have concerns that are external to their borders and external to the borders of the 4 states. So there's a real reason to think about things like resource adequacy and transmission, and think about it from an area that is in fact a region. So that's sort of, I think, how I got here. The commissioner and I met during our Clean Power Plan work, and he invited me to be here to moderate this. I'm joined by people from 3 other states. We had a gentleman from Wyoming who we had invited and was hoping he could make it. He was unable to. It was Ken Miller. He's a board member with the Wyoming Energy Authority. So he is not here. And I will not speak for Wyoming, but I think I know a fair amount about the state of Wyoming, and there may be some things that I can talk about, but not with any imprimatur of power from the folks in Wyoming. But I'm also joined from Montana, Mike Freeman. He is the governor's natural resource policy advisor. So he's gonna join us. He also gave me a ride from the airport last night. So he's a heck of a Uber driver. And then Tad Greener, regional economic competitiveness officer in Utah. So he's in the Office of Energy Development. And Tad, in our prep call said, well, I'm pretty new at this. And it was a fair statement, but we're going to probe as much as we can, kind of the thoughts that you have about Utah. And then I guess he's right here in front of us on the screen, virtually joining us from Idaho is Rich Stover. He's an administrator for the Governor's Office of Energy and Mineral Resources. I think I also see, or at least he was earlier, John Chatburn, who used to, I think, have that position, right, Rich? John was in your position, but now is on the Idaho Public Utilities Commission. We worked a lot with John. I've worked a lot with John. I was on the WEEB board with John for a time after I left the governor's office, and have a great deal of respect for John and for all that he's brought to these conversations. So, as you heard this morning, it was really interesting that when the commissioners were here and Commissioner Ackerman, who I work with, was asking the commissioners questions. I said, listen, we are not policy people. We don't develop policy. So I think Brad Johnson, in his wisdom, said, well, we better have some policy people who can think about this and can talk about this. And so much of my orientation is about policy and is about state policy, whether it's governors or legislators, and really about the forces, the levers that have caused the power sector to transition in a pretty serious way over time. And that's what we're going to talk about this morning, or this afternoon. So it is about resource adequacy. And probably start with you, Mike, go to you after that, Tad, and then Richard. And I think it's pretty good for us to begin with a common sense, a common definition of resource adequacy. They've talked about it in prior panels, but sort of your sense about that. And then, to the extent you can, how much does the governor's office, the governor's cabinet, how much does resource adequacy concern them when they think about energy policy, keeping the lights on for Montana customers?
Sure, and thank you, Governor. It struck me, you're just to kind of kick this off. I know you mentioned regionalization, this regional issues about, how do you get all the states together? And I would say they should all get together and do what Montana's doing. So they should just agree with us. But, I think that, in terms of resource adequacy, I think, it's laid out in our statute, and another statement I want to make is that, our Public Service Commission has a big role in this. And anything I say, I want to recognize that role, their statutory role in make sure there's adequate service and just and reasonable rates. And we work well with our Public Service Commission, but not intending to say anything for the Public Service Commission. But I just want to cross those T's and dot those I's. But it is a relationship, and I think resource adequacy essentially means the lights go on when you flip the switch. I think that certainly if you talk to your ratepayers, your consumers of electricity, I think they would give a very good definition of what resource adequacy is they have what they need to do what they need to do. I don't want to be overly complicated about it. You have enough electricity to serve your demand. And I think that, for Montana, we take an all of the above approach. And in terms of putting resources on there, we want to make sure that our regulatory agencies our DEQ and our other agencies are providing clear guidance on how those get built, how resources get built. And we do want Montana to be a place for energy producers to come here, invest their capital in Montana, have clear rules, clear guidance of all kinds. I mean, we have great resources in the state. Obviously the fourth largest state in the country. We have wind, solar, coal, gas, I mean, and obviously tons of hydroelectric generation. I think we're very blessed to have so many resources here in the state. And so resource adequacy for the state, from our perspective, is to make sure that we are open for business, that we're giving clear signals to the regulated community. They know what the rules they need to follow are, and our policy has always been that we want to have affordable energy and plenty of it. I mean, our industries in Montana rely on this. I mean, we have our large consumers of electricity need these supplies, and it's a huge part of Montana, especially given our drastic weather changes. Our energy system is big and complex, and there's not a lot of people here, and so we face challenges that are not other states may not face them the same way we do, but so in terms of resource adequacy, I don't want to overcomplicate it. I want to say that the way we look at it is that people are getting what they need to live and thrive in Montana. Electricity, I know the governor likes to say this, electricity and energy in Montana is not a luxury item. It's a necessity. So moving on to the role of the governor's office, obviously we play a role in the legislative process. We work with our legislature to develop our laws and policies guiding our agencies. We work with other states in our role and work with our delegation in Congress as well. And so we are supportive of markets that function properly. And we're interested in exploring these cautiously and making sure that, in our regional basis that we're trying to solve a specific problem if we enter into this. And so a lot of it has to do with, getting the right information to the appropriate decision makers and working with our commission, our legislature to work through these together. So I don't know if you were there for lunch, but the FERC commissioner, Commissioner Danning, who spoke, basically said, you're going to enter a market, be cautious. Yeah. I think we share that. We share that there in Montana. We are very cautious. A lot of it does involve the Public Service Commission and their roles and responsibilities. And we want to, from the governor's office perspective, we do want to take a cautious and incremental approach to looking at opportunities.
Thanks. So Tad, I'm going to throw the same question to you, and then Rich, you'll be after that, and we'll talk about resource adequacy and policy considerations inside administrations, both in Utah and Idaho. So you go, Tad.
Thank you, Governor. I am really grateful for the opportunity to represent Utah today. Thad LeVar gives expresses his regrets that he couldn't be here and participate today. And the Office of Energy Development in Utah just a couple of months ago got a new executive director, Greg Todd, and he also wanted to be here today and couldn't be here. And I want to thank Commissioner Johnson for putting together this opportunity. I'm going to follow the lead of the esteemed panel earlier today and say I'm not speaking for the governor. I'm speaking for myself. I report to the executive director, and he is the governor's advisor on energy, and he will make his own decisions and advise the governor appropriately. Utah is an any of the above state. Often hear people say all of the above. We are specifically and legally an any of the above state. And resource reliability is not an option, and affordability is key. Utah has been a net exporter of power and energy throughout most of its history, and would like to continue to be a net exporter of energy. And so with that, I'll turn it back over to the governor.
Okay, Rich, Idaho, want to talk about how governor's office or agencies inside the administration think about resource adequacy in your state.
Thank you, Governor. Yeah, so similar to what my colleague from Montana mentioned, we have our duties here in Idaho, and the governor's duties include to provide reliable and secure and low cost energy to our citizens, and we work in tandem with our Public Utilities Commission, who's charged with making sure that the prices that our citizens pay for the energy are just and reasonable as well. We're always mindful of resource adequacy issues, in particular because a bulk of our energy portfolio is provided by large scale hydropower that have been under attack or subject to scrutiny for many years. So we're very mindful of that. And you couple on top of that the various policies outside of our state border that are having a direct influence on the IRPs of our utilities and our consumer-owned utilities, and how they approach making sure that they deliver the adequate resources. It puts us in a position where we are taking a very close look at all of these issues and participating in every forum that we possibly can to understand what's going on out there and advise the governor appropriately. Specifically as it relates to our resource adequacy, we're in a pretty good shape, but we are also mindful of the energy transition and our unique geographic location relative to the states around us who are driving a lot of these discussions. So we're trying to be mindful of that and be positioned to make sure that, number one, we fulfill our primary missions of keeping reliable and secure and low cost power to our citizens and businesses, but in addition, taking advantage of the economic opportunities that are presented by energy transmission.
So thanks, Rich, and I appreciated that this conference wasn't just about resource adequacy, it's about risk. And I think you said a very interesting thing, and I think Montana's experienced this as well in terms of risk. Part of that risk is that other states pass policies that really can implicate not necessarily the availability of resources in state, but the ability to be a net exporter like you want to be in Utah, or, and I'll speak for Wyoming. Wyoming is a net exporter of coal. It's the number one coal producing state in the country. And as this energy transition has seen coal dependent communities shut down, as it's seen coal fired generation close really in a pretty precipitous way by utility standards. This is a pretty fast transition because we've seen that was a risk that either people saw coming and began to prepare for, or maybe they didn't. But it's certainly in terms of planning, if you're an exporting state, then there are a variety of risks, but it strikes me that the things that have happened in Washington and Oregon, for example, were risk to states that exported energy into them. I don't know, Rich, if you want to answer that first, then we'll turn to you, Mike, after that.
I'm sorry, Governor, I cut out for a moment there. Are you asking how we're addressing the policies surrounding us, impact on?
Just like it was because this conference is also about risk. You mentioned that other states were doing things from a policy perspective that implicated your ability to export energy, and so how do you identify that? Is it something that might be coming, and then how do you react to it when that's happening?
Yeah, certainly. We're aware of the states around us. Idaho does not have a renewable portfolio standard. Most of the states around us have either statutory or voluntary standards. But we're also mindful that the utilities themselves have set clean energy goals. So it specifically as it relates to policies impacting our reliability, the way we are addressing those is making sure that we are keeping a finger on the pulse of all these movements around us, being involved in all the forums and work groups that we can to know what's coming at us. And I think we've got a relatively good idea of how these are influencing, but we're taking the opportunity to make sure that Idaho's voice is heard to the extent that we possibly can, protect our interests, and not not be forced, not to have policies forced upon us that are not, number one, allowed under our regulatory scheme or identify with what Idaho values are.
I know, Mike, we talked this morning about Colstrip. It was a big part of the discussion when the commissioners were talking, and certainly Colstrip's been impacted by what other states have done from a policy perspective. Talk about that in the context of risk to being a net energy exporter as Montana was.
Sure. I mean, Colstrip, do you have water? Do you need water? I have water, sorry. Okay. I do have kind of a working through a cough here. But Colstrip is a huge part of the economy of Montana. And to the extent we can, we want to make sure that Colstrip operates to the end of its useful life. We're sorry, excuse me. So I think that, in terms of, in terms of exporting energy, certainly we don't have a right to force utilities to buy our electricity, but we want to properly function. We want to be able to have the opportunity to sell it to willing consumers of electricity. So we have Colstrip has been, like I said, a huge part of the Montana economy. And we want to have some self-determination, I think, for the state of Montana as to what we can, what happens over the future of our Montana, economic assets. Now that's, it's a continual discussion, and I think there's been, a lot of discussions around Colstrip, but I think that it's just an important place, and we want to make sure that we're doing what we can to make sure that our regulations aren't discriminating against any particular form of energy. Our environmental laws, our regulatory laws, that we're treating our resources fairly. So,
Ted, I know that, as a net energy exporter, you export a lot of energy to California. And actually, I think Los Angeles Water and Power is shut down, right? Is it a coal plant or a gas plant?
IPA has a coal-fired plant in Utah that they are converting to natural gas.
Okay, and so kind of the same thing in terms of other states and their policies. California would be seen probably in terms of states that have advanced regulation around emissions with AB 32 and other laws like that. Their CAFE standards for the transportation sector, they've really done probably as much or more than the other state. How does a net exporter into California then look at that as a risk to your own economic modeling for energy exporting?
I don't think I understand the question.
Okay, I'll try and say it differently. It's just, it seems like that is a risk to your economic engine. If energy and you're a net exporter, it seems like states that are reducing emissions are saying, basically, we're not going to take fossil fuels. Washington and Oregon both passed laws that said no fossil fuels over the wires, no coal over the wires. That has impacted Montana in a pretty serious way. It's impacted Wyoming in a pretty serious way, but you've been impacted as well.
Well, clearly we have been impacted. It impacts our economy in that we are no longer mining coal. But the other thing that's happening right now with regards to IPA and the IPP power plant exporting to California, I think they are making the transition to natural gas to support their policies and their climate goals. They are also pursuing a hydrogen solution at that same facility so that it will meet their requirements.
We're actually Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and New Mexico are trying to develop a hydrogen hub under the Inflation. No, that's the Infrastructure Act that has billions of dollars, actually 8 billion in money for hydrogen hubs. And so we're working with the state of Utah and Wyoming and New Mexico to try and bring that to the West.
And in fact, we are very supportive of Colorado's efforts with Excel to develop a similar project in Colorado to generate electricity from hydrogen,
So one of the
from green hydrogen.
risks that we, I think, have alluded to, or maybe talked a little bit about, but not gone into much depth, is about climate and climate change. And I think, you know, which you said, your state doesn't have a renewable portfolio standard. You have no coal on your wires, so it's not maybe as big of an issue. What's pretty interesting in this country, 25 states belong to the Climate Alliance, 25 do not. And there are probably 30 states that had some kind of a renewable portfolio standard or goal at some point. Many do not, but those were originally put in place because of concerns around, I think, environmental concerns, but later because of climate. And now we've seen a merging of policies that once were about sort of technologies like renewable energy, wind or solar, into climate legislation, where states are setting their own goals around that. And I think those states may see a risk if they don't do that around climate differently than other states that that may or may not see it. But I just want to put it out there. I know it can be a little bit controversial. It can get to be a political wedge of sorts. But you know, I just think it's important in terms of resource planning and thinking about states like Oregon or Washington or New Mexico or Colorado that have done a lot in the West around climate in the last few years. You know, what do governor's offices in a state like Montana, what's the governor's office think about this, and how much are you oriented around thinking about climate as a risk as opposed to a barrier?
So climate as a risk. I mean, I think initially, you know, we've got a pretty clean, you know, portfolio already. I mean, we don't have a portfolio because we exceeded its, you know, we're far beyond the sort of renewable, the clean energy standards that were in place. But, you know, as far as a risk and as far as that goes, it's the concept is, climate is a global issue. Montana's, you know, a pretty small piece of the overall thing. There's of the overall picture, and there's no reason why Montana should be bearing the cost of that. In particular, there's plenty of federal regulations. There's, you know, we don't. I think that, you know, in terms of what we should be doing in Montana from the governor's office perspective, you know, we need to focus on what we do well. And we do think that having you know, a clear regulatory system will bring innovators to Montana. Now, there's plenty of capital flowing to all sorts of renewable clean energy facilities. There's capital flowing to traditional fossil fuel generators. And you know, we want to be open to that innovation and let them experiment, let them risk capital. And have Montana be a place where, you know, you can come here and know that you're going to get a fair shot no matter what your technology is going to be. And I think that will address these larger term questions.
Rich, you can talk about that if you want, but I'd also really like you to talk about something that you mentioned earlier, and that's the utility sector making their own goals. And I saw something I'm sure you're interested in, the PacifiCorp. Today announced that it was joining Cal ISO's extended day ahead market and also joining the Western Power Pool's RAP. Fascinating, right? Because they say they're doing it as a cost savings for their customers, but also because their participation in the energy imbalance market has allowed them to cut emissions. So save money and cut emissions. So reliable, affordable, and sustainable in a way, because they're focused on emissions. And, you know, how much then with the kind of momentum in the industry for doing those kinds of things that PacifiCorp announced today, how much does that impact you as a policymaker?
Well, I think it certainly I guess number one, I'd say it wasn't a huge surprise. I kind of anticipated that Pacificor would lead the way on EDAM. And as you mentioned, they've indicated and have shown apparently that they've saved hundreds of millions of dollars in participating in those other the date or the 5-minute and 15-minute market. But as it specifically relates to climate issues, Idaho is an agricultural state like the rest of you that relies significantly on hydropower. So climate issues have always been in the mind of our citizens and our leaders, regardless of the fact that we have not followed some of our other states and implemented specific climate particular measures as they relate to energy production or transportation. But climate is a significant risk in Idaho, especially as we're looking at drought conditions and wildfire conditions impacting our ability to produce power from our large scale hydro.
That's kind of the story in the West as well. I mean, the stories about the Colorado River, the most recent stories about that, there was a Washington Post article, really did a pretty good job of delving into it and said that Lake Powell could quit being a hydraulic resource or hydroelectric resource as early as June of 2023. That need could be without hydroelectric power, delivering it as early as the summer of 2024. That's pretty drastic. And so for planners in the West thinking about water and hydroelectricity is certainly a part of it. And I don't know, Tad, again, if in Utah, that's something that's a part of the risk issues that we look at in assessing the resources, the grid, the delivery of electricity.
Oh, absolutely. You talk about water, and I grew up in Utah. I went to school in Arizona and spent most of my adult life in Las Vegas, Nevada. And I have been in places where a cup of water was worth more than an ounce of gold. So water is a critical thing. And let me just also emphasize this, is that all 4 of these states that are invited to this are beautiful states, and they all rely a great deal on have economies of tourism. It's very important to Utah, and our skiing industry is dependent upon snowpack. In addition to that, we along the Wasatch Front have the unfortunate benefit of being in a basin and having really significant inversions and have air quality issues that are unhealthy. So climate, both on a micro and a macro level, are huge to Utah. Absolutely.
Yeah. So it's interesting because, most of the country does have some kind of an RTO or an ISO that governs the market, and even the Southeast, which it's kind of moving in the direction of doing more things regionally. What are the barriers in the West to doing more regional or sub-regional, at least if not planning formally, at least having regional conversations about resources, regional conversations about policy choices that impact this state and other states? I don't know. Do you have a sense about that, Mike?
I think that we do. There's organizations out there that have regional discussions. I think they happen. Does that magically make it we're all going to agree on something? No, but it's the process of having those discussions, having a venue for those discussions, finding out, what's in the realm of the possible there. But I certainly think that it's the challenge is every state's different for a reason. There's, I think that's good. It's healthy to have differences in policies between the states. There's always going to be discussions around, coordinating between states when it benefits those states. So I think that really, I think that's the question that drives the coordination is, will there be policies that do benefit each of these states? And it's finding the policies first. Mm-hmm. And then if you don't have those policies, the coordination is not going to going to result in anything, but it doesn't mean we're not having discussions.
So, Rich, I'd turn to you and say kind of the same thing. What do you see as the advantages of regional discussions, and are there barriers to it, and particularly barriers to discussions about markets, about regional markets in the West?
Yeah, absolutely. And frankly, the one that every state will, maybe not California, but outside of California, the issue that they bring up with respect to the regional approach to addressing these issues is that of governance. All of these states have to, if they're going to be participating in regional efforts, which we are, like all of you, we've got to make sure that we have an equal chair at the table. We've got an ability to put our input in and have it be considered and meaningful, and not just be rolled over by the behemoth. So governance is a big issue. Accurate data with respect to these regional approaches. You've got to make sure that the data that decisions are based upon is reliable and reliable in terms of how it impacts us on the ground here in Idaho or in our neighboring states. And then we got to look at how you allocate the costs to taking on a regional approach in the confines of what our regulators are able to do. So, the overarching issue is, do we need to engage on a regional level? Yes, we absolutely do, and we are. And within the confines of the Western Interconnect, we certainly can look at take advantage of opportunities to have sub-regional approaches with neighbors, which frankly can be advantageous when we've got certain states with similar policies, like the states here at this conference.
So it does seem, and I want to follow up with you, Rich, it does seem to me that everything you talked about is absolutely important, that we had a governance conversation in Colorado at the airport hotel, where the Western states were invited to talk about, if they expanded CAISO. It's fascinating because of the number of objections that states were raising at the time. But it seems to me governance data, those are solvable problems. And there are a group of utilities that are even examining, Western utilities, examining sort of whether they think a market is a healthy idea. It seems to me that governor's offices and commissioners should be in a conversation that says, are they solvable problems? And are there benefits that mitigate other risks by having a conversation about regionalization of discussions and possibly regionalization of markets?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely appropriate. And, I've heard this, I'm not coining this phrase, but I've heard somebody say, you can set policy at your own peril if you don't have the right stakeholders involved. So you identified it exactly correctly. If we're going to be addressing regional or sub-regional issues, we have to have the commissioners involved with their input and the utilities as well. And we've got to understand whatever policy is being proposed, how that actually can be implemented by the utilities in a manner that is not too risky and doesn't impose unfair costs on the ratepayers.
I mean, there's no governor that wants his citizens to pay for somebody else's electric rates because of policies that they put in place that increase those. That's just a fair statement. Having been a governor, I think I can make that and say it's pretty much across the board. But I think the question then becomes, are there reasons to do that benefit your customers? Have regional discussions or consider, and I think you said it well, Mike, if you're going to do this, you're going to have to be very, very cautious about it. But it doesn't seem like that's a reason not to do it. To have conversations about regionalization of planning, perhaps transmission planning as well, and then regionalization of markets over time.
I mean, it's just a matter of doing the due diligence. As Commissioner Danley had highlighted, we've had other markets that don't produce great outcomes, and to learn from that and to look into it, because once you're into a market like this, it's hard to get out of it. And I think that it's just, and it's not, you say markets, it's as though there's this cookie cutter market out there that you take off the shelf and you plug it in. And I feel like, as you had hinted at earlier, the West is very different. And, we've got, a lot of political diversity. We've got a lot of public power involved here. There's geographic challenges. There's a lot of federal land issues that if you're going to construct a transmission system that provides services to a market, that's going to be challenging. So you have all of these issues. And so I just think that in any policy process, and I'm not championing, I'm not speaking specifically about any one thing, but you need to identify the problem first and not the solution first. And so, that if you're looking for, if it's a solution in search of a problem, I don't think that's a great way to go around your policy making. Find it. If you have, a specific resource problem, create a specific market-based solution with, competition at the heart of it to try to address that and evaluate on the merits of that specific proposal. And if that develops into something akin to a market, then so be it. But I just think the incremental approach is a more cautious approach, and there's no reason not to ask these questions. And that's why we are involved in these regional discussions, and we're having them. And I think more information. I know there's been studies out there showing benefits of markets. In my view, those studies have been sort of on a generic market, and we need to maybe take it to the next level to see what specifically folks are proposing.
So I'm going to take the viewpoint of an independent power producer CEO and say, I can actually make money producing electricity here, and I can export it to a state that has this kind of climate goal. I just can't pay a pancaked rate every time I cross a different transmission line. So they're trying to solve that problem. And I think that's one of the things that is, at the front of their mind, utilities' mind, is there a way to solve for a problem that they have with too much cost, a too high of cost for transmission to actually export power. So Tad, Dr. Laura Nelson was in Governor Herbert's office in Utah, and she led a study. It was funded by DOE about regional markets. And I don't know if you want to comment on that, but it was also a very cautious approach, but and it involved, just players in the West about what a market should look like or could look like. I'm sorry.
In 2021, no, my apologies for jumping in. In 2021, they completed a study titled Western States Market Study. Utah was the lead, but it was a collaboration with Colorado, Idaho, and Montana. And it studied two scenarios of regional transmission organization. And it definitely did show a potential for a net benefit. So I think that is that study is and has been very influential.
And so because we're all from a state that was involved in that, it'd be just those states, it'd be interesting to have, follow-up conversations about that. And I think that's probably what Brad's thinking about, sub-regional discussions around this. But I think that study is probably one of the best that has been done about the possible benefits of it and going into it. So we're about halfway through our hour and a half. I'm going to turn it over to the audience, see if the audience has questions for our panelists. Please take the podium. Tell us who you are also, if you would, please.
Rob, Montana appointee to the Northwest Power and Conservation Council. And one of my concerns is the aspirational goals of people who want to decarbonize soon and to a large effect. And I don't challenge them on that or anything to that degree. But I think we, and particularly further north along the Rocky Mountain chain, are particularly vulnerable to a polar vortex in the sense that we believe that 16,400 megawatts will cover a heat dome throughout kind of the West WECC. And we just saw a late one in California just here in September. But I just wonder, as we go forward and you do want to decarbonize and you do want to have more renewables and you have less dispatchable research, that is, you have less shafting that is driven by some kind of a source that you know it will and can run. Because all of these renewables in their cyclical nature, they cannot be depended upon. So if 16,400 megawatts covers a heat dome throughout the West, I don't think they're necessarily looking at a polar vortex in our region as of the Texas type, in the sense that in a vortex or a heat dome, it blows in or it comes in, but then it settles. It's a stagnant mass. Wind basically drops to near zero or very, very low. It gets a little better the further south you go. But when we're at Montana, we know when the sun comes up and when the sun sets on December 21st. It's not very long. My concern is as they want to stop shaft-driven dispatchable resources replaced by renewables, and I know batteries make a difference, but they have a short duration. What can we do in a polar vortex? The solar isn't there. It's the azimuth of the sun is lower. It's not the perfect storm, it's the least storm, and the wind isn't there. So I think we have to really be careful and be sure that whatever resources are there that are shaft driven and they're reliable and they're dispatchable to get us through a very long duration Texas type polar vortex. And that's the one thing I am concerned about as we go forward, that we look at that specifically. Wind doesn't, and renewable resources at this point do not produce in that particular scenario, and the sun is at a lesser perspective of production. And a summer vortex, they have excellent solar. So that's my thought going forward.
Okay. Mike, you want to comment?
I don't know.
The rule I had as governor, if it's not a question, don't answer it. Yeah, exactly. It's a fair statement. I do have a comment in response to it, but
I would just say that responding to any particular resource challenge, it is part of the greater process for, utilities have to plan for that. It's part of their obligation to try and figure out what resources they need. And on the other hand, it's the commission to review that and then to carry out their duties on that. And so I think that fits within, the bigger picture of resource adequacy. That's ultimately the system that is, that's the system we operate under, at least here in Montana. And I think that we want to see that process work. And that involves both sides of the regulatory divide working together on that. So,
Ted, any comment?
No.
Okay, no comment. Rich, you want to comment at all?
Sure. I mean, I guess I would agree that that we have to account for the intermittent nature of renewables, and the utilities have a duty to make sure that they plan accordingly for that intermittency as well as weather events. And I guess I will just put in a plug. That's why some of the exciting things come down the pike in advanced nuclear and small scale modulars are encouraging when the technology and the price point comes down on that.
Yeah, so I facilitated a conversation over the last 2 years with CEOs of utilities, CEOs of environmental NGOs, and I'm just going to mention this really sort of in response to your comment, which is most of the utilities represented, their CEO had been chair of Edison Electric Institute, and most of them, I think all of the ones represented had goals, emissions reduction goals. None of them know how to get to zero. And, Xcel has an 85% reduction of emissions by 2030, the most ambitious probably in the country. It's in places that are blessed with great renewables. So that's partly how it's going to get there. But they would admit they don't know what's going to happen in the last 15%. And there are other utilities say we'll get to 60 or 70% carbon free, but we don't know the last 40%. And so I think what we have is really sort of a challenge to figure out, is it advanced modular reactors? Is it a sodium cooled reactor like TerraPower is building in Kimmerer, Wyoming? Is it carbon capture and sequestration? We have a plant on the Southern Ute Indian Reservation that has a new kind of highly combustible turbine that has less CO2 effluent from it. And then they capture the CO2 and sequester it. Net Power is the name of the group that developed it. And so there are a lot of different things at play, but the question sort of becomes, how do you think about this regionally? Because I think it's a fair question about polar vortexes, but it's also a fair question to say Montana's blessed with a lot of resources. We have the ability to export resources. So what are we going to think? How are we going to participate in getting to that last place that these utilities around the country have said they need to get to? And I think it's just a way to take your question, agree with it, but broaden it a bit to say it's not just Montana, it's everywhere, because there's no utility in the country, I think, except for maybe Hawaii, the Hawaiian Electric Company, that has the ability really to see that path to 100% fully right now. So it's kind of a good question to have there and have it out on the table. Other comments or questions from the audience? Commissioner.
Thank you. Again, Tony O'Donnell, Montana Commissioner. Your original question is, what is resource adequacy? It seems to me that the most direct way of explaining that is, what do the words say? Are your resources adequate for what your needs are? So the needs are regionally dependent. So Montana's needs are a lot different from Wyoming's needs and anybody else. So it needs to be taken into account that way. Tad, I really appreciate it. And I'd never heard this before. Instead of the all of the above, any of the above. I like that very, very much. It's whatever will get the job done. That's the important thing. So I appreciate that. The other thing is the word Colstrip has been mentioned a few times. And in terms of any of the above, it seems to me that an existing resource in particular should be identified to its particular and perhaps unique qualities. So as I understand it, Colstrip, being a mine mouth coal generation plant, is one of only two in the country. When you're connected to your fuel source by a conveyor belt, then right next door, if you need more coal, you blow it up, and if the conveyor belt doesn't work, we have a lot of pickups in Montana. You know, we can get it there. Other than nuclear, a mine mouth coal generation plant to me is the most reliable source of energy that you have. When I was at a commissioners meeting just recently in New Orleans, one of the commissioners from another state, Midwestern state, was telling me that one of the big issues that he has is getting the coal from Wyoming or Montana or wherever to his facility. We're talking about the rail strikes and everything else like that. You know, there are all sorts of problems with that. But as I say, there are only two mine mouth coal generation plants in the country. And so that offers an extraordinarily unique reliability opportunity. And it's already there. And I just think that, again, I'm just focusing on that any of the above, is to find out what you have, what's working best. And the whole thing with, again, resource adequacy is when you have to take a look at it to say, what's going to work most of the time, or what is going to work some of the time? That's the whole thing, because we have, as commissioners, we have an obligation to keep people alive. It's different from Arizona. If they don't have enough power, people die in the summer. In Montana, when it gets to be 45 degrees below zero, people are going to die. They don't have enough power. So when Northwest Energy 2 winters ago had to go out and buy power on the open market for, as Commissioner Johnson mentioned, $900 a megawatt hour, the $900 indicates the scarcity of the product. It's measured in the market price. Okay, that had to do with how much power was available. When they announced 4 coal plants shutting down in Wyoming, and Centralia closing down, and Navajo Generating Station, and all these different things in Colstrip 1 and 2 closing down, it means that the market of what available electricity is shrinking on there. For the co-ops, when they talk about the 4 dams on the Lower Snake being breached, to save the fish. Okay. A worthy goal, but the unintended consequences, as Commissioner Panucci pointed out, dams are very useful to flood control as well. It's not just electrical generation. So there's a lot of things to take into account on the whole thing. But the main job of states with extreme weather is to keep people alive. That's what we have to focus on. And until something comes up that can come as close to a guarantee as possible that it's going to provide the power that's necessary for people's lives, until something comes up to replace that, I think we have to go with that. That is our commitment. That is public policy. It may not be the best economic policy. When the coal plants were shut down, they said they were not economically feasible or whatever the term is. That's fine. I understand that in terms of economy, but how do you factor in people's lives? And that needs to be factored in somehow. And I don't know, I'm not an economist, I don't know how to do that, but it needs to be taken into account because that's our job. Thank you for your consideration of all these issues.
Thank you. Thanks. Anyone want to respond or comment? Thank you, Commissioner. Any other comments or questions from the audience? Sure.
Hello again. Yeah, Jeff Ackerman with the Center for the New Energy Economy. I appreciate how Commissioner Johnson set up this day of having regulators in the morning and that you heard regulators with their niche and then deliberately pivoting this afternoon to governors, policy advisors, energy offices and the like. And I want to approach you on that context that each of you in different ways have proximity to a governor, some closer than others, but you work thus in that space. And I worked in that space in some past lives of that. And a governor in a perfect world has his or her own agenda of 3 or 4 X number of policies they'd like to keep the top conversation on and certain policies they'd like to not have show up in the paper. To that context, how do you take this issue of either resource adequacy or market development in the region? What pieces of this are you possibly trying to weave into what the governor talks about and thus is part of what you're trying to be at an economic development aspect, a new technology? What are the pieces you see coming at you, you're trying to deal with to the degree you kind of can candidly talk about that? It's just us folks and those on Zoom that are listening in. So, it's a private conversation. But so to what degree can you talk about what your governors are ideally trying to steer this conversation toward that fits to a governor's agenda? What you see coming your way that may not be what you want to deal with, but you have to deal with anyway. Both sides of that.
Rich, you want to take that first?
Sure, thanks. Working the conversation of resource adequacy into policy discussions with the governor, we've been talking about reliable and low cost energy for Idahoans as long as I've lived in Idaho, which is about 50 years. And, our governor in Idaho is one of his primary goals is cutting red tape and allowing opportunities for businesses to develop. And so, when we're talking about resource adequacy in the governor's office, we're talking about making sure that our portfolio is protected and reliable and low cost. But there is certainly an opportunity to take advantage of the emerging energy markets because Idaho does have a lot of natural resources that fit into that. But then everything in this conversation is made clear. It's complicated because we've got multi-use issues with land. If you're talking about putting utility scale renewables, that's going to take a huge footprint. So it's a balancing act. Generally speaking, the governor's primary goals are making sure that we ensure the reliable, secure, low cost power and clearing the governmental obstacles for markets to emerge in Idaho.
When we were doing our work with the Clean Power Plan, John Chapman was a part of it. I took a group of utility CEOs or their government affairs people to the White House to talk about the need to build transmission more rapidly. You set a 12-year target under the Clean Power Plan. Your plan had filed in 2018, you had a 2030 target. Idaho had taken 13 years to build a transmission line. And I think correct me, you're 66% federal land in Idaho, something like that, over 60%. Colorado's 45%. I don't know what Wyoming is. I know Wyoming's 45%. I don't know what Montana is, but 48, Nevada's 85. And so this is this serious issue that I think you alluded to as well. Mike, do you want to take a stab at Jeff's question?
I think that as far as discussions about resource adequacy for the governor, it's about, I think it's making sure that Montana doesn't get in its own way, making sure our agencies are operating well and our process and our regulations are clear. I know I mentioned that before, but I think if it's sort of if we build it, they will come mentality. We're going to set up a process that's predictable where businesses want to come to Montana to build generation facilities. And also it's a lot of our major employers. There's a few things that can put them out of business, and not having electricity or having really expensive electricity is one of those things. And so it's not just about our resource adequacy and our electricity. It's a larger picture of the economy and how it fits into that issue. So it's really it's a broad issue. We do want to export we have great resources that folks elsewhere want to buy. And I think we're encouraged by the investment coming to Montana to develop those resources. But looking out for Montanans to make sure that we have enough and it's at a reasonable cost. So I do think we're very process oriented to make sure that our agencies function smoothly and that we're focusing on that. So
Ted, thoughts about that?
First, I'd just like to say that, and I think this applies to other states that are participating today, is that Utah's Governor Cox is a very courageous man in that he took the any of the above tact, because when you do that, you're not going to make anybody happy.
I laugh as a former governor.
So that's one thing. But when we start talking about influence, I suppose, and with the governor, I go back to this morning's panel where I listened to commissioners talk about how public service commissions, public utility commissions implement policy. They don't necessarily enact policy. Yet there's such knowledge and institutional knowledge and legacy in whether it's the Public Service Commission or in Utah, also the Division of Public Utilities. I just asked myself, the Commissioner Johnson convened this meeting today, but my understanding is he also invited legislators to, and so therein is an opportunity for influence. And so I think, I guess all I'm suggesting, and from my naive perspective from Utah, is that I need to figure out a way where I can bring all the resources to bear, my expertise in the Division of Public Utilities and expertise from the Public Service Commission, and come up with concise, informative information to give to the governor.
Yeah, and it's hard enough to do that just inside the state. And then because this is a regional play, then you have to figure out how to do that in a concise and informative way for the governor about the rest of the region. And I think that's probably why we're here, as to think about either how you discuss this as a region or sub-regionally so that you can inform the policymakers.
Well, and I just want to say on a regional basis, because the Office of Energy Development, but for that study in 21 on markets, the Office of Energy Development is really focused on the state, and not just the state utilities that we have authority over, but we have 45 cooperatives and municipalities, right, in the state of Utah, and we work closely with all of them. So I don't know where I was going with that, so I'll give it back to you.
That's okay. No, you're back. Any other comments or questions? I've got a couple of people coming up. Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Governor. I think maybe it would be an understatement to suggest that in most cases around the region, the level of effective communication between the regulators and the legislators is suspect at best. Certainly and that's not an indictment of the legislators or the regulators. It's simply a statement of fact that we live in two different worlds on two different planes, and legislators often are not in a position where they need to be up to their ears in the details and the nitty gritty of what it is they're making decisions about. So it creates a challenge there. And I guess my question, both to you, governors, former governor, and to the energy office folks, is would it make sense to try and develop a more effective relationship between regulators and energy offices as an interface with the legislators? In other words, certainly the state energy offices under the auspices of the governor are going to be working on these policies with the legislators, with the policy makers. I see you all as in that executive branch as the policy drivers. But we have tried on a number of occasions. First time I worked with Commissioner Ackerman was on a panel at Council of State Governments to talk about trying to increase the effectiveness of our communication with legislators. We've made numerous attempts to try and get legs under that idea and have failed. And I'm just wondering if maybe we took the tack of working with state energy offices as an interface with legislature. That might not be more effective.
Maybe want to respond to that? I have my thoughts about it, but
I mean, communications always important. I think we do a pretty good job of it here in Montana. And I do think it would be state specific. I think I can't speak for any other state on how that goes, but I do feel like we have good communications here, and I think we have a process that works. But would be interested to hear what other states have.
Rich, do you have any thoughts about being the interface between the legislature and the commission?
Yeah, well, we're a pretty small state as well. We in general work closely with the legislature and our counterparts in the commission. But I would just add that in addition to using the energy office as an interface, if we're setting policy, as I mentioned earlier, we've got to have the utility providers, the energy providers and producers at the table, and the transmission owners at the table as well. Because, as you mentioned, the legislators may not have the granular level of detail or knowledge. Perhaps an energy office has a little more. The commissioners understand how it plays out on the regulatory side. But the utility providers have got to be there because they have the highest level of knowledge about how their system works and how they're meeting those demands. So they would have to be a part of that conversation as well. But absolutely efforts to make sure that the legislature and other policymakers are adequately informed as they set policies is critically important.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, Jeff Ackerman was on our commission, but before that, he ran the energy office. That helps a lot. And I have a lot of sympathy for legislators who come in and, they have to, I just met with a legislator. She has to have her 5 bills ready within a month after being elected. She was campaigning for really a full year. Just do that. And then she's going to deal with a really broad set of topics that as a governor, you get cabinet members to deal with them, and the legislator may not even have a staff member. We run a legislator academy. My center does, and there are a lot of legislators in this country who have no person staffing them. And so I have some real feelings for legislators and what we ask of them, especially on subject matters that run pretty deep. So I think, Brad, what your suggestion, Commissioner, what your suggestion is exactly right, is communication is absolutely key. And, trying to help legislators, support them, find ways to support them in their development of a subject matter of knowledge around something like the electricity system or transmission systems or transmission planning. That's really important to do. I think, yes.
Thank you. Diego Rivas, Northwest Energy Coalition. This morning, we heard a little bit of discussion on the other side of the equation, the demand side. So a couple of prompts, just one, I'd love to hear what other states are thinking on the demand side, resource adequacy wise, and maybe to spur that a little bit, something tangential, I guess, to typical energy efficiency demand response. But an issue that hasn't come up at all today on the demand side, on the load side, big users, we talked about EVs, we talked about a little bit about electrification. How are states looking at things like data centers and crypto mining and kind of some of these big hogs that could have some really big impacts for resource adequacy?
Rich, you want to tackle that first? If not, that's fine.
I mean, generally speaking, in Idaho, those data centers or big big consumers of the energy load work directly with our utilities, and then utilities work with the commission on rates.
Mike or Ted?
I would echo that. Certainly, you know, we have no opposition to data centers being built in Montana. Like I said, we're open for business. It's just a matter of they do take a lot of energy, and you need to have a good supply of it. So again, it's I don't want to continually kind of oversimplify this, but we have a system where you go through an IRP and you know, you have this process where we determine how much energy we're going to need and what sort of investments we need to make in our system. And as Montana grows, we're going to need to make some. So,
Ted, any thoughts?
My thoughts echo the gentleman from Idaho. The reason we give these utilities a monopoly is with the expectation that they'll serve our customers reliably and affordably, and that's the bottom line.
I think the question the part of it that I'd like to just answer has to do with what states do, because we do a lot of work with states around the country, and so a lot of states have energy efficiency resource standards that require the utility and actually pay the utility to do a certain amount of energy efficiency work with their customers. And, you know, other utilities and utility commissions have focused pretty heavily on demand side management. We had a pretty interesting thing happen in Colorado this year where, ironically, it was the failure of a coal plant. So Comanche 3 was built while I was governor. But it's really been a problem for Xcel. It's probably not operated almost as much as it's operated. Well, it failed. And it failed on a really hot day. And what Xcel did, they have a relationship with their customers where they can notify them that they're going to turn off turn down their thermostat, turn up their thermostat or something. But they do it really on sort of a voluntary basis. In this case, they didn't. They just did it. They just went in and changed how their home was being air conditioned at that particular time so that they could keep the lights on for the rest of their customers. And, you know, that's demand side management. That was a demand side management program that was supposed to be voluntary for the customers, but Xcel said it's necessary to avoid it. Something sort of similar happened in California as well, where, you know, they used demand side management in California to avoid brownouts or blackout or rolling brownouts, just because they had the ability to do that and have the kind of relationship and the technology with their customers. So I think we'll see that. I don't think it's the answer to all the problems, but I think, you know, understanding that it can be part of a solution when we're worried about failure or worried about resource adequacy or worried about intermittency, demand side management can be a thing, part of it. Other comments, sir? Spencer.
Spencer Gray with NIPSI, the Northwest and Intermountain Power Producers Coalition. I wanted to go back to the governance discussion. Rich mentioned the longstanding concerns with governance of the California ISO, ultimately stemming from a single state's governor and legislature. FERC has in front of it now a tariff from the Western Power Pool, in which the states have a standalone committee that's populated either by utility commissioners or state energy offices that can sit in on meetings of the participants in the resource adequacy programs meetings, and also pause the passing on to FERC of a tariff change proposed by the participants. The Western Area Power Administration, the Upper Great Plains, is a member of Southwest Power Pool with customers, co-ops in Eastern Montana. And SPP has a similar states committee that actually has additional responsibilities. It can make a counterfiling at FERC if the state energy offices again, or the utility commissions disagree with the direction of the RTO. So kind of holding up those two examples compared to what the CAISO has today, I'm wondering for the three of your states, and maybe Governor, you could speak to Colorado too, what are the parts of multi-state governance for markets or regional programs that matter the most in your view?
No, thanks. I think that's the question. I think looking at the resource adequacy proposal from Western Power Pool, I think making sure that, either Montana has an equal standing as a state in other, I know SPP has the state's council, and I think that's has been a fairly effective mechanism. I think that ensuring that the state does have a voice in there in some way. Now, everyone's going to be slightly different. And in terms of, with a sort of a bigger responsibility beyond just resource adequacy, say we're talking about a full RTO or something like that, I think that would, we would seek additional, input and safeguards in terms of our input. No, I think those are two good examples of things that can be done to ensure, as far as governance solutions, to move to increase the state's voice as a state.
Rich, you want to tackle that?
Yeah, that is the key question, how us, states like Idaho and our neighbors at this conference are dealing with making sure that we are adequately represented in these market discussions and developments. We're involved in all of the opportunities we have right now, and as these concepts are evolving and developing, everybody's saying the same thing about making sure that we are all adequately protected for our citizens. And all I can say about it is that we will continue to be involved and just make sure that we have an authoritative voice in these discussions.
Thanks, Ted. Any comment? What I would add to it is really so much about trust. And it sounds very basic, but our conversations that have been sort of in the West, this even when I was governor, people still remembered Enron, 7 or 8 years later, and remembered really how kind of much damage it did to different places in the West. And I think it damaged the market conversation in the West in a pretty significant way. So much of what I think is part of regional planning, and if it's planning toward a market or something short of a market, it's about trust building. And I think, the extension of CAISO to an energy imbalance market has done some really positive things in terms of trust building, both for, the utility sector, but also utility commissioners, and even I would say policymakers in the West. And the other kinds of things that you alluded to, Southwest Power Pool, and I think Xcel is, toyed with Southwest Power Pool and is now part of the energy imbalance market. You want to grow to a place where you trust it. And when, I don't know if you ever saw the first draft from CAISO about the governance model, that was the legislative draft. It was something that people reacted to pretty seriously in the West because it really felt like California had this veto power. And so what you want if you're a smaller state in California, and we all are, is you want your citizens to be protected, your customers, for utilities to be, protected from having to pay rates that they would not otherwise have to pay if they weren't part of a regional market with California. And you want to be able to trust that there's a system in place to do that. And it feels to me like we're building that over time. And the question is it, going to take a series of regional conversations or sub-regional conversations to ultimately get to a place where there's the level of trust necessary. But it's interesting to me how much that seemed a barrier even among like governor level people in the West. Yes, sir.
I wasn't gonna do this, but Governor, I just need to comment to that, though, that if I'm in agreement that governance and we can overcome governance in this room and with our group, and let's say governance was no longer an issue, I would be hard pressed in serving 10 years in the legislature to think that our current legislature would ever allow us to give governance away to California. And the first person called into their committee will be me. And so as much as that sounds like a way to do it and to have trust and to collaborate and to do all those wonderful things, I'm a creature of the legislature and they're going to have their own mindset. And I think that I'm not the only one, and Idaho's not the only state. I think that this is a reality that has to be addressed and has to be faced if we're going to be candid about how we're moving forward.
So that's I was going to say power sharing is, you know, a part of this. And I think, you know, a lot of commissioners think how much of my own like role and responsibility will change in a regional market. And I think it's a really fair comment that you just made about what legislators may or may not be willing to do. Let me pose this to you. If the governor of Idaho were to say, and I'm not, let's say, a hypothetical governor, not governor, but a hypothetical governor comes to the legislature and says, these are the benefits to Idaho citizens about being part of a regional market. Do you think that changes the reaction that the legislature may have if the executive authority can lay out a series of benefits to it?
When I served in the legislature, I would have listened to the governor very closely, but I can't speak on behalf of the current legislature. I never would assume to do that. Things change, time changes, but I would hope that everybody listens to what the governor's ideas, Governor Little or whatever governor that would be. But I would never assume to speak on behalf of our legislature.
I think that's right there. And the reason I ask you that is because we have two states, Colorado and Nevada, have both passed laws that require investor-owned utilities to join regional markets by 2030. It feels to me like coming from there, as opposed to coming from the governor, you might have a different reaction in some places. Like if it's a legislator's idea, it wound up working in Colorado, it wound up working in Nevada, but there are places I think where it may not, because it's not sort of this, the genesis of it being from the governor may change the reaction that legislators have. And I only ask you that really not knowing the answer.
Well, I'll just make one more comment to something else that I did here is that if we had a utility that I agreed that I could turn my heat down or whatever was required of me, and that was a voluntary measure. In Idaho, I firmly believe that if they decided to do that on their behalf and not on my behalf, but my choice, I think I'd be in front of the legislature tomorrow morning.
Yeah,
I just do. I think we have a different climate than that. But anyway,
I understand. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Mike Cash. I'm the Vice President of Transmission for Northwestern. And actually, the conversation today has been fascinating to me. Being part of the group that's required to serve load during the peak times, summer, winter events. I mean, resource adequacy is really important to us as a company and near and dear to us, obviously, as a state. My question is, or actually a discussion item and then your reaction. In Montana and probably other states in this group, we have various forms of retail access or retail markets. So that some customers, some of our largest customers, in fact, don't really actually receive their supply from local utilities. We deliver to them, but they don't receive their supply. So the question is, from resource adequacy standpoint, so that those customers can also enjoy the benefits and security of resource adequacy, how do we create a level playing field so that the rules for resource adequacy can apply to all customers?
Do you want to tackle that? Rich?
I don't know. I'd welcome any input you have.
Anybody else?
I've got enough.
Anybody in the audience want to think about that? Because I think it's obviously this is a difficult question that you just put on the table. I have no panelists willing to answer that. Spencer is willing to at least give you some of his thoughts.
Again, Spencer Gray with NIPSI. I would just share, NIPSI represents some of the retail marketers in the West and including in Montana. The RAP program is designed so that any load serving entity can be a participant, take on that resource adequacy obligation. And some of the retail marketers in the West have stepped into that role and participated in RAP. So just to comment on the structure of RAP allows for that regional participation.
Thanks. Any other questions? Okay, well, I think we're going to wrap up the panel. Speaking of wrap, and I really want to thank the panelists. I'd like you to show your appreciation as well by giving them a round of applause. Thank you. And is it a break, Jeff? Is that so? People, I think there's a break. And when do you reconvene? You know, is it 3:15? 3:15 reconvene. Thanks. Go ahead.
Hey, is there anyone on deck who could do a quick sound check and just let me know if you can hear me?
I can hear you, Chris. This is John, but I'm not there.
That's okay. I mean, maybe we'll get half the audience. I appreciate it, John.
I'm sitting home. I've been sick all week, so I just
Oh.
lurking.
You sound awful.
Yeah, just getting working on a different singing voice.
Oh,
I'm gonna try to record an album like Joe Cocker style, kind of that gravelly. Yeah.
right. Okay, good luck with that. Go find some hot tea in the meantime.
Yeah. Well, hopefully someone in the room answers. So try again and yeah.
Ah, feel better.
Thanks. Appreciate it.